probably already all know, we're just asking everyone to stay on mute for now and probably switch video off as well. If you have any interference, you might want to put your video off and just listen. Sometimes that helps. So I'm Jen, Carolyn's colleague at the Fisheries Museum, where none of us are broadcasting from tonight, unfortunately. It's all locked up. But good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome on a cold night in Anstruther in Fife. I have to say that now because not everybody is together. We're all spread out across the country and beyond. We've got at least one guest from Germany, which is lovely. Our guest, Esther Rutter, is also speaking from Fife tonight, where she now lives, but she grew up on a Suffolk sheep farm and learned to spin, weave and knit as a child. Her passion for the fascinating story of wool and its place in society shines through in the eloquent and engaging writing in her book, The Golden Fleece. I first met Esther when she came to the museum to research her chapters on Scottish ganseys, I think, Esther, I think that's right.
Yeah, that's right.
And she later returned to deliver a really fun, practical knitting skills workshop for children as part of our learning programme in 2018. And that had been inspired by an exhibition we'd had of Dutch ganseys, Stella Roos Dutch ganseys, that we'd held that winter. And we can just only dream of such things at the moment, having international exhibitions and children in the museum doing things. It's just a thing of the past, but hopefully the future again soon. Later, Esther provided valuable advice and the groundwork in setting up this project, Knitting the Herring, which many of you will be familiar with. And the project was originally envisaged to be much sort of more mobile and interactive pre-pandemic, but we've managed to reach still a wide and if not wider audience nonetheless through our popular online events programme. So thanks to all of you at home for your interest. Thank you, Esther, for being here tonight. The book from which you're going to be reading sits on all the project team's desks and was particularly useful through the spring and early summer when we couldn't get to the resources in the museum. Federica and Carolyn, the project officers, had never worked in the museum before and they had to do it all from home on their own. So it was a really tricky time, and your book really gave them and myself a good reminder of some really good information. It's so well researched. It's truly gripping thanks to the way it weaves in humanity behind the history, and it really does take us to the heart of rural, coastal and urban knitting communities across the country. So if you speak as well as you write, we're in for a treat. And I'll hand over to you now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. Hello everyone. It's absolutely lovely to be talking to you all today from Fife. I'm going to be reading from the book, so those of you who have already read it, I hope you don't mind the repetition, and for those of you who haven't yet read it, I hope it will give you a good flavour of the type of book it is. So I'm just going to switch to my presentation slides now, so just bear with me a second. Here we go. Okay, so, steady, there we go. So my book, This Golden Fleece, it follows my journey where I spent a year working my way around the British Isles and knitting a garment from 12 different places that had very specific knitting traditions. And obviously, the first thing you notice about the British Isles is that it's an island nation. And so it has an immense coastline, over 6,000 kilometres, and that it has obviously many, many islands that make it up. And so I didn't start my research with ganseys. I actually started with knitting in the Yorkshire Dales, but it became very apparent very quickly that there were so many traditions that belonged to Britain's coastal communities, and in particular the ganseys. So I'm just going to start with, this is the beginning of the book's second chapter, and it starts in February in 2017, and yes, here in Fife, where I still live, and where I did a lot of my research. I do not agree with T.S. Eliot. February is the cruelest month. 28 days of rain upon hail and frost upon fog. Two Dore Scots words, snell and dreich, sum up this cold and bitter weather. Car journeys lengthen as we creep along country roads, watching for black ice and standing water. Power cuts plunge us into darkness, and we keep a weather eye on the forecast. After the dark days of December and January, February is the last full month of winter we endure. Our reserves, buoyed up by Christmas and the New Year, are now at their lowest ebb. Above the 56th parallel, it can feel like we've not seen the sun since the clocks changed in October. There's another month to thole until March springs us forward. We hunker down at home, gorge on television, and keep up our winter weight. What better time of year to begin a gansey? Heavy and dense, these traditional fishermen's jerseys are tightly knitted to repel water, encasing the wearer in a woolen cocoon from neck to waist and wrist. From the Pentland Firth to the Yorkshire to the Yarmouth roads, ganseys were the de facto uniform of Britain's fishing fleet from the early 19th century until the advent of waterproof PVC. Even if we do not recognise the word gansey, most of us have seen one. Under his yellow fowlies, the old seaman on my tin of Fisherman's Friend cough drops wears a navy one, and Captain Birdseye sports a cream gansey under his dark blue blazer. One famous photo of Ernest Shackleton shows the explorer gazing into the distance under a pair of furrowed brows, clad in a gansey with a pair of thick fur mittens dangling from a leather strap. Usually dark blue, but occasionally grey, cream, or other colours, ganseys were worn up and down the UK's coast and along Britain's inland waterways. Before inexpensive mass production, most were knitted at home by the wives, mothers, daughters, sisters, and grandmothers of the men who wore them. Knitting a gansey will be my challenge for this dark and enervating month. So that's where I started. Now, when I went to the Scottish Fisheries Museum, I was amazed at the depth of the collection there. Over 100 ganseys, not just from the immediate Fife coastline, but from all over the UK, particularly in Scotland. And if any of you haven't already had the chance to go on to scottishgansey.org.uk, I could really recommend that you have a good look through the photographic archive of the ganseys. But something that really caught my imagination as I was doing my research was that how much information, it wasn't just the technical details of the gansey, which is fascinating about how they're constructed and the patterns that have been used, but also it was the social history that went with it, the names of the people who knitted them, as well as the people who wore them, and little stories, little snippets of their lives. So if you look here at the bottom corner, you've got this brown gansey knitted by Mary Muir Murray, who owned a drifter called the Integrity. And the fact that we know that she was ill, she was too ill to rectify the mistake that she made at the neck, making it too tight. And the fact that we know that she was a speedy net mender. I don't know that we know anything else about her except through that gansey history. And it was that really kind of got me interested in that broader culture of knitting, not just the very specific garment making, but the communities that the garments came from. Now, in the case of the gansey, or ganseys more generally, these communities were often very distinct and very different from most of the rest of, particularly the Scottish community. And here we can see some of them. So these are both photographs of fishing crews from Fife. One's from Saladike and one's from Pittenweem. And the boats, so the gansey fishing communities on the Scotland's east coast were largely the result of the Highland clearances. So whilst there had been some fishing that was done in ports for centuries before that, it was the forced movement of a lot of farming communities from the richer, the more profitable land in inland Scotland over to the coast where the living was much more marginal, and they were sort of forced onto the sea to earn their living. And they often didn't own boats. The laird who moved them off the land would then sell them back a boat, and so they had to buy it from him to buy their freedom. And there are tales of lairds forcing the fishermen out into the sea in all weather just so that they could pay him back for the boat that they'd been forced to rent from him. And you can see from this picture, some of it, I think you can see there's definite sort of certain family resemblances that go on between the boat crews. Yeah, they were predominantly families, although it would be neighbours as well. But you also see, of course, that they're all men. And the crewing of the fishing boats was very much a kind of a men-only thing. But it was the women who had a really important job. In fact, not just one really important job, but a series of really vital things that they had to do to make basically to make fishing viable, and to keep the men safe and warm and the nets in good repair. And so when I was in the museum, I found several photographs of the women from these communities, and this is one of them here. This is from Buckhaven. And it's a posed photograph because it's been taken outside. A lot of this work would have been done in the house as well as outside. And you've got the whole family here, including the cat, and the woman in the middle. She's got a dish and then a big scalp or basket of mussel shells beside her. And then you've got the younger woman knitting, and then the man doing something with the line on the right hand side. So it was basically the lives of these women who made the ganseys that I became totally fascinated by. And I'll just read you another short section from the book, which looks at the Scottish communities and the women therein. Work and wait and dree your weird, or dread your fate, went the saying. But more than just waiting, women worked hard on shore. Small lining required fishing lines a mile long, with 600 to 2,000 snids, or short horsehair threads, that hung from the main line. From each snid hung a hook with a shelled mussel as bait. Before each fishing trip, women baited the hooks with these fleshy lures, but carefully, for one cut or scrape from a hook could lead to blood poisoning. The lines were then coiled into sculls, wicker baskets carried aboard ship. Boats took at least one scull for every man aboard. And this isn't ancient history. In the mid-20th century, a fisherman from the Fife harbour of Cellardike remembered his mother rising at 4 a.m. when she had a baby in the cradle, with the cradle string tied to her foot, rocking the cradle and with her hands baiting the line. Once these tasks were done, the women weren't to sit hand idle. If they weren't baiting or selling, cooking or mending, cleaning or repairing the nets, they were knitting. Men needed warm, waterproof apparel to wear at sea, and spinning and working the resulting yarn had long been part of the crofter's skills. Historically, women and children would have carded and spun fleece from their own sheep, but the Industrial Revolution enabled the production of strong machine-spun worsted, tightly plied, a perfect, almost waterproof yarn from which to knit ganseys. The women often sold their catch too, and they would carry the gutted fish in creels on their backs, walking their business from house to house. It wasn't just the creels that the women carried piggyback. Beginning a sea voyage with wet feet was unthinkable, and yet before the 20th century, many smaller fishing villages did not have piers. So women bore the men to the boats on their backs, walking out to where the boats lay at anchor and wading through waist-high water to deliver the men dry to their vessels. Fisher laddies need fisher lassies, went the proverb, and the fisher lassies' lot was far from easy. So I decided to make a gansey. So as I said, for each chapter of my book, I go through the motions of making the garment that historically was made in each particular place. And I wanted to make, I didn't have a fisherman in my family. So I had to look elsewhere, and it had to be, I wanted it to be a working garment, because I think it's important to realise that these were working garments in the main, not exclusively. There were definitely best ganseys that people wore for special occasions, but I wanted my gansey to be worn outdoors and to see how it performed in a way. So instead of having a sort of fisherman's gansey, mine was a gardener's gansey, because that's how my dad earns his living. He's a gardener and he's out in all weathers. And so I thought that, yes, this was a really useful thing for him. And I decided that because he doesn't have a connection to a particular fishing community, as a lot of the gansey makers, did have, they came from these very specific communities, quite separate from a lot of other sort of the inland communities. But I still wanted it to have meaning for him. And so I decided to copy the shape of a gansey that I found in the Manx Museum in the Isle of Man, because one of my earliest memories is going to the Isle of Man with my dad, because he used to make and race motorcycles. And so we went over to the Manx TT. Fortunately, a brilliant knitter called Frailing Close Hainsworth had already done a schematic and worked out the pattern of this gansey in the Manx Museum. It's the only one they have there. And it shows, you can see that both the neck and the sleeves are plain, and they've also been repaired and replaced and reknitted. And that's what's going on in the photograph that you can see in the bottom corner there. And this is a woman from Fife, and she's reknitting the arms, or perhaps knitting it for the first time. It's hard to tell in that image. So I knew that even if it came a crocker out in the garden, if it did need to be redone, I could do those bits quickly and simply because they were plain. Then so once I'd done that, I then designed the patterns for the rest of the gansey, again very much with my dad in mind and with both family history and his work as a gardener. So you've got a ridge and furrow, which is a common gansey motif, but obviously it's lovely to have that kind of the ridge and furrow of the ploughed fields in there. And moss stitch as well, lots of moss stitch. But I also added something called railroad, which is not a traditional gansey stitch, but you can see it there in the middle, just kind of at the centre of the yoke area. And I put that in because my father's father, he used to repair the railway sleepers. He used to relay them. And so that was how I thought that gave us another kind of generation back in our own family heritage. Now I knitted the gansey entirely on double pointed steel needles, 40 centimeters, because I wanted to understand what it might have been like to be a gansey knitter in a time before the ease that we have modern convenience. And so I think you can knit a gansey any way you like in a way, but I wanted to keep it traditional and use the double pointed ones, so I did. Now you see a lot of, as I'm sure many people will know him who are listening to this talk, you see a lot of different patterns from different places that are recorded in the ganseys, and that you can see some examples where there seems to be a sort of a general type or style of gansey that is attached to a particular place, even a particular village. And there's a lot of theories about why that's the case. Was it because bodies could be identified if they've been washed up, and they could be sent back home to be buried? And I didn't find any evidence of that particularly happening. No historic evidence of it. But I did find that there was a very, very transient workforce which was responsible for the knitting of a lot of these jumpers. So whilst some of the fishing communities the women were very much on land supporting the community, supporting their men and the men going out fishing, by the middle of the 19th century, and you had a big boom in herring, and huge shoals of herring were coming in. And so the women who were skilled in preparing the fish, they would actually follow the shoal of herring because it would come across from the Atlantic and work its way all up down around the north and down the south, down the east side, and even out as far into the Baltic. And so they would follow the herring, and they would gut them and they would salt them into buckets. And so they were very skilled women, and they had to work incredibly hard. I think you can see that in these photographs. But as you can also see, they also wore ganseys. They weren't just, we think of them now as a sort of a fisherman's exclusive garment, but it wasn't just the men who wore them. And I love that the Scottish Fisheries Museum does have these few records of the women working there. So you can see here that I'd say the women did the herring work, and then they also knitted, and they knitted for their own, for themselves and for their own families, but they also knitted for sale. And it took people about, or the professional people who were making ganseys for sale, it would take them about 6 weeks to finish a gansey. So when I thought that I was going to do mine in 4 weeks and research and write a book, I was probably, setting myself up to fail there. But I did find that we crossed into a bit of family history again, because when I was researching the herring girls' journeys and the different ports that they came into, I found that they came into Lowestoft in Yarmouth, in the Norfolk and Suffolk coast. And my dad remembers seeing them there in the 1960s. And he remembers being there on holiday there with his mum, and his mum lived in Suffolk all her life. She was very surprised to see these women knitting as they walked along. I think she was a bit shocked and a bit awed by it. So so it's nice, to have that kind of family kind of remembrance, not family history per se, that connects me and my dad to the gansey and the gansey knitters historically. So there are so many other places where there are ganseys recorded. So here you've got these are Shetland ganseys. This is another photo from the Scottish Fisheries Museum, and you can see this is from Sandwich, and you've got a crew. You've got 2 pairs of brothers in here, and I think you can pick out there is family resemblance. But you can also see that they're all wearing the same or a very, very similar gansey. And so it seems that in some places that ganseys were particular to a boat, not necessarily to a place, but to a boat, which kind of makes sense, I guess, when your boat is your livelihood, a bit like wearing a football strip, or something that connects you to this really important thing in your life. And then obviously in Orkney you find them too. So this is a photograph from Orkney Archives. You can't see so much of the detail on here, but you can obviously see a gansey, a fisherman at work with the creels. And then you find them on the inland waterways as well. So the Leeds-Liverpool Canal, which you can still sail on, is still an open navigable canal. You can rent a boat from Silsden, and you can see that this boat, this large barge here, was where that came from. And the men have got the ganseys on, and you can see this is a more detailed photograph here from the National Waterways Museum, which has ganseys in its collection. And again, the inland waterways communities were very distinct, very different, almost had their own kind of language or dialect. And it's interesting that you get that coastal community which is separate, and you get that waterways community which was separate. And I think that's one of the reasons why the patterns and the wearing of ganseys was preserved in those particular places or within those particular communities. Now, obviously, one area that has a huge gansey knitting tradition is the Yorkshire coast. And there in particular, there's a really strong sense of, having a Whitby gansey or a Filey gansey. And there are many, many places along the coast where there have been ganseys recorded, which have been attributed to a particular place. And in part, this is, it reflects how gansey history was recorded. So in the 1950s, when a lot of these patterns were recorded, the person, Gladys Thompson, she was one of the really early knitwear historians. She wrote them down, she recorded the patterns where she saw them. And so it was her that gave them the names Whitby or Scarborough. And so there's been a kind of, from that point, it's become sort of common to say, oh, well, this is a Flamborough gansey or a wherever gansey. But actually it really kind of refers more to her system of classification than, you could only have this style of gansey from this one particular place. Now, today in Whitby, there is a woman called Deb Galanders, who you can see in the photograph here with the red hair, and she runs a brilliant initiative called Proper Gansey, and it's all about ganseys and the history of the people who wore them. So, and in a 20th century context, she collects dirty old jumpers, she says. And so because that area does still and has had for longer than other places a vibrant fishing community, she's been able to draw on the people that come into her shop. She runs a health food shop, to find out who has ganseys and the stories behind those ganseys when they bring them in. Now, Deb herself, she fell in love with ganseys at a party, and it was a party in which she also met the man that you can see in the picture here on the right hand side, and he's got a wee fag hanging out his mouth, and he's down there on the seashore, and he's called Alf Hildred. And I just want to read you another section from the book which describes how Deb fell in love with ganseys. And I want to read this because I think it's important to note that gansey history is not just a thing of the past, that anyone who makes a gansey today is unwittingly kind of in that tradition themselves. And it should be recorded. Deb first fell in love with ganseys at a house party. In the hallway, she found a man on his knees, fag in hand, so amused by the story that he was telling that he couldn't move for laughing. He wore smart jeans and an eye-catching navy jumper, gleaming with a patina of use. This was her first meeting with a gansey, and with trawlerman hippie Alf Hildred. Like Scottish tartans, ganseys can be tribal garments for those who wear them. Deb was transfixed by Alf and his gansey. But she wasn't from the tribe that made them. "Give me 100 quid and I'll knit you one," said Alf. 2 years passed and still no sign of a gansey. After inviting Deb for a fitting once the gansey had been knitted as far as her armpits, Alf declared that the fit was far too loose and immediately unravelled the whole thing. That gansey was 21 months of begging and 3 months of capitulation, Deb says with a grin. Finally, handing over the gansey, Alf told her its pattern was called Rope and Ladders. Deb had been researching gansey and she thought she'd seen the pattern elsewhere. "Isn't it called Betty Martin?" she asked. Alf looked sideways at her, sucking on his fag. "What do I know?" he shot back. "I only knit the bloody things." So I think that it's really important that because knitting history and working class history are so deeply enmeshed, it's really important to see them within the context of the whole community and the people who are still part of those communities. And I think anyone can make a gansey. You don't have to be from a fishing community to do that. But I think it's very interesting to consider why we feel drawn to them today. And I think part of it is because that sense of belonging, that sense of being from a particular place and people, is something we perhaps feel a lack of in our modern lives. And it's so perhaps we seek it out, some of us at least, through knitting and the making that we do. Now, I've used the word gansey so far in my talk, and that's very deliberate because I have been referring to the ganseys of Scotland and of England's eastern coastline. And there, the word gansey is quite distinct, and that side of Britain has a big influence from the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands as well. And there, gansey is very similar to the Scandinavian words for jumpers, gense, and garn and yarn are essentially the same word. So if you kind of follow that line of etymology, a gansey or a yarnsey is just a woolly. And that makes sense to me. It's hard to, trace etymology directly, but it makes sense because you do find that the exact same word in Scandinavian languages. But a lot of people call them Guernseys. And that's really interesting because obviously it's not a million miles away from Gansey, the Guernsey, but actually the Guernseys come from an entirely different part of the country, and that's not the only word that's used for them there. So you get Guernseys, jerseys and knit frocks, and of course I'm talking about Cornwall and the Channel Islands. So again, vibrant fishing communities, and the people there had a long history of knitting garments very similar to the ganseys that you find further north. Now, I was really lucky in that there's a fabulous book by a woman called Mary Wright called Cornish Guernseys and Knit Frocks, which was published in 1978, and Mary Wright was she's still alive, and she was kind of commissioned to do research into this particular style of knitting, because people in Cornwall were worried that its heritage was being lost, that Guernsey knitting, Jersey knitting, knit frock knitting was going to be a thing of the past, and it shouldn't be. It should be recorded. And so she spent the best part of 10 years talking to people and interviewing them to find out what was still out there. Was there this kind of tradition still being practiced? And she did find some people who had living memories of knitting. She also found, she tells in the book, she tells some very funny stories about people being able to recognise individual ganseys with a very practical purpose. So this woman had made her ganseys for her extended family, and she had put, because she had a large family and all the ganseys were very similar, she put the initials of each family member under the armpit. Anyway, one of the ganseys, the Guernseys, went missing, and she was compelled to, she wanted to find it basically, and she was at market, and then something caught her eye, and she saw on somebody's body a gansey that looked very familiar. And so she went over to this man and she said, lift your arm up, and he did, and there underneath he had his initials worked in. And she said, that's not your gansey, that's my grandson's gansey, that's his name, and I put them in there so I'd know. So yes, so you had Guernseys, Jerseys and knit frocks. Now obviously you've got the Channel Islands of Guernsey and Jersey, and the word knit frock, a frock was not actually a word for a dress, historically speaking. It was for a kind of a man's shirt. And so a knit frock is just like a knitted shirt, which makes a lot of sense because ganseys are very close fitting, and so you can see where that phrase has come from. So I went to Polperro, where they have a museum on smuggling, fishing and ganseys, which is well worth a visit, and this is the view from the museum. And then I hopped over to Jersey in the Channel Islands. Now when you arrive in Jersey and you come into the big port, one of the first things that you see is a Jersey, a gansey. I'm going to keep using gansey because it's the word that I feel kind of closest to with my particular heritage. And what you've got here on the left is a fisherman in his jersey, and it's a modern statue, and it's about life size, and it sits there right on the quay. And of course, the word jersey doesn't just belong to knitted fabrics. Its history is really interesting, and it wasn't just the knitting community in Jersey wasn't just a preserve of the fishing community. So what you've got in the middle here are actually gardeners, like my dad, men working in the big greenhouses that they had in Jersey. They particularly grew tomatoes that were sold in Britain, and you can see the men there both wearing ganseys, not so close fitting as the men did at sea. And also you can see that they've got seams on the shoulders here, so they're more like a smock than a gansey. And that's really interesting kind of disparity that you see between the Guernseys or the Jerseys and the ganseys, is that there's a lot more seaming. It seems like the Channel Islands would do a sort of piecework that was then seamed and stitched together rather than knitting everything completely in the round. Now as I say, Jersey has this really kind of vibrant history of sheep and wool work, and so you can see here historically there was a distinct Jersey sheep breed, and they're a bit like the Manx Lochtons, which you can see the modern breed is here on the green grass picture with the green grass. And then I can find one image of what, I don't know if it's an artist's impression or whether it was taken from life, but you can see you've got the original native Jersey horned sheep there at the top picture, and in some cases they had 4 and some 6 horns on them, but there's nothing left genetically. They seem to have died out, and it seems like the Manx are actually a separate breed that have been reintroduced into Jersey and the Channel Islands today by the National Trust. But you also can see in the landscape of Jersey, there's lots of little kind of hidden clues about its knitting and its spinning past. And so can you see it's got on the right hand side, you've got a man and a woman with sheep and cattle driving them to market, I think. And these kind of long tree-lined avenues are a real feature of the Jersey landscape. And I discovered when I went to a museum there that they also they had a particular usage within knitting's history. And I just want to read you a small bit of the book that deals with that particular part of the story. So this is me arriving in Jersey. The following day dawns, and it's a mild, damp morning. I head into the island's heart, catching a bus bound for Lahugby. Stepping off at a crossroads by a small garage, I turn down quiet lanes overhung with trees and fringed by fields. There is no one else about, though I can hear a tractor's rumble in the distance. 300 years ago, the lanes of Jersey would have been thronged not only with travellers, but also with groups of local women. In the warm weather, women would assemble in large numbers and sit in a ring under the trees. In the breezy shade, they sat and spun and knitted, chatting and singing as they worked. As in other communities in Britain, when knitting constituted a major part of the economy, judgment of the hand idle could be fearsome. And it was described in these unequivocal terms by a Jersey historian. A woman seen walking without a stocking in her hand is stigmatized with idleness. Now, the morning that I was on one of these broad roads, very early and very quiet, I was on my way to a particular museum, and it was a Hampton Country Park Museum. And what Hampton does, for those of you who haven't been, is it's a kind of living history museum. So they have historic buildings and they have people kind of costume interpretation inside it, and they have a mix of historic items but also replicas, so that people can actually touch and use them. And I was absolutely fascinated to find these really unusual spinning wheels. I've not seen ones with such ornate kind of carvings on the spindles anywhere else. And so on the left hand side, you've got the one at Hampton Country Park Museum, which is a replica. But at Solmoray Costume Museum, I found this beautiful one, which has this lovely striped red and white and black patterning all over it, and it dates from 1821. I don't know who did it, and I wasn't able to find out any more about why it had been patterned that way or whether that was typical. But I thought that it was a really striking example of vernacular folk art that was particularly related to spinning and to knitting. Now, I also discovered I don't speak the languages of the Channel Isles, but I did pick up a little bit of the phrases, and one of them related very much to the knitting. Now, Jerrier is the name for the language that's traditionally spoken on Jersey, and there's this wonderful saying, "Le cat feel sa trem." So it describes the noise that a cat makes when it purrs. The cat spins its wool, because it's that same purr, kind of rolling. And I thought that was a lovely kind of little felicity that is recorded in the language there, and that connects it to the spinning and the knitting traditions. Now, on Jersey, there is this tradition of, so depending on where you were in the island, the knitted ganseys or Guernseys where they had a particular meaning, but it wasn't necessarily done by the patterning which you see elsewhere. You had, if you came from the northwest corner, which was the sort of roughest land on the island, the people there didn't wear the navy jerseys that you saw elsewhere. They were called the grey bellies, the grievants, because they would use undyed yarn and sort of natural colours. And apparently this nickname is still used or still recognisable among older Jersey people, the grey bellies, and with their grey Guernseys on. Now, I did visit the one surviving knitting Guernsey production company on Guernsey, and it's called Latricotta. And it's been going since the 1960s, and it uses these old knitting machines, which you can see on the right hand side. They actually most of them came from Yorkshire, because as the Yorkshire yarn industry started to suffer from competition from abroad and started to kind of shrink, a lot of the old machines were sold off, and some of them found their way to Guernsey. And so they're still used there to this day. The Guernseys, the Latricotta Guernseys, are hand knitted, are machine knitted for the bodies and the arms, and then they are sent out to predominantly older women who hand knit the gussets, and then they are linked together on the linkers back in the workshop. So you've got the pieces, the gussets, and the neckbands, and then so it's all linked together on the linking machines. So it's a funny mix of machine and hand knit, but I think it's really interesting that there is still a vibrant Guernsey knitting economy there, and that is still viable, because back in the Middle Ages, both Guernsey and Jersey produced hundreds of thousands of stockings every year, and they produced exquisitely fine knitwear. Mary Queen of Scots, it's believed that the stockings that she wore to her execution was of Jersey make. And so it's another island like that, the Hebrides and also the Shetlands, where you still have that kind of continuous strand of knitting history that goes back for centuries. And I think it's the comparative isolation in one way that keeps that tradition going, but also that distinct kind of that awareness of being distinctly from a place, and that sense of tradition being very important, that means it survives longer at the kind of fringes, where you have other kind of pressures and other influences as well. So I want to finish with my dad's gansey. So I did finish it for him. It took me the rest of the year. Now his birthday is on the 28th of December, so it was just brought me round to the full year. I did, as you can see, I did make a mistake. I made one arm, and the fit on it was completely different to the other, so I really hastily had to reknit it and seam it together, which I did quite messily. But he absolutely loves it, and he was a very happy recipient of it. It was the making of it that it was my favourite thing that I made of all the 12 garments that I made during that year. And I found that the making of it was like a constant companion to have the gansey with me all the way through all these different places that I travelled and all these different things that I made the gansey, and was my familiar. And working it, I just want to read you out the very last part of the book, just to give you a sense of my feelings about being part of this knitting tradition. Whilst knitting undoubtedly has many traditions, tradition itself is a fraught word that can divide opinion. Many of us feel comfortable about and comforted by the idea of a preordained way of crafting, as if by reaching back into the past, we can authenticate ourselves and what we make. We seek origins and earlier inspiration. We draw on archives and memories and ideas handed down to us from sources specific, shadowy and singular. The idea of one truth, a single and all-encompassing method or technique that dictates how things must be done, sometimes beguiles. And like the tablet handed down to Moses from on high, it is a patriarchal model, and it can also be elitist in its unassailability. It potentially stifles individual voices under a universal truth. Looking to the world of folk music, where the concept of tradition bearers is strong and relevant, I find a useful parallel. Singers not only transmit older songs learned often by ear from other singers, but are also free to amend lyrics, tempo, tune, and style. Authenticity can be difficult and complex to define, but providing that the original source is openly acknowledged, a singer's role is to enliven as well as preserve, to breathe new breath into the old songs. For unless they are sung, the old songs die, and though folk music diehards may bemoan new styles of performances, many acknowledge the need for newness. In this way, folk memories, melodies and lyrics do not die but grow on, like a vined plant twisting itself across the body of an old tree. To me, tradition is important not just because of its attempt to preserve the ever-changing, but because of its ultimate function, to draw humanity together, to help communities coalesce. So thank you very much, everyone.